Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. This week, I figured we'd talk a little bit about a caretaker convention and what that really means. We've seen some complaints over the Twitter machine over the last few weeks from conservatives primarily, who are arguing that the government, in announcing all these spending measures after the House rose, is contravening the caretaker convention in advance of the election. Slight problem there is that the caretaker convention doesn't actually come into effect until the writs for the election are drawn up. So let's talk about what that means. What usually happens in an election is that Parliament is dissolved, there are writs drawn up so that every riding has a writ that says this is now in an election, we are looking for a new MP, that lets the Chief Electoral Officer know that the election is now on. Similar if there was a by-election, but these are all happening at once. And so what that means for government is that it kind of goes on autopilot. Now, we still have a functioning government in terms of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, and why that is because the Queen, by means of the Governor General, always needs to have someone to give advice. And because government operates on advice to the Queen or the Governor General. So they are still in charge, but what happens is what we call a caretaker period. A caretaker period is basically a certain amount of autopilot. So things can still happen, the public service still functions, day-to-day business still happens, but they're constrained from doing anything big or out of the ordinary or, making any major decisions in this time because we know that there's an election going on, so they can't do anything that would have any, possible repercussions for this election. That also applies to things like appointments. So, for example, we just had a Supreme Court appointment. Why that was done now as opposed to when the outgoing justice was actually due to leave, which was right around the writ period, was so that they wouldn't get caught in the caretaker period of making it look like they were trying to stack a deck on their way out. We did have an instance in history once where a prime minister who had just lost an election tried to fill a whole bunch of Senate seats and make a bunch of appointments, and the Governor General at the time said, no, you lost the election, you no longer have the authority by which to advise me to do that. So that's kind of why this caretaker period exists. What I think we should mention, though, is that because we've created this fixed election date, it's created a longer period between when Parliament rises for the summer and when it dissolves for the election. And in that period of time, the government is basically free to do all these things like announcing spending measures. It may be a bit unseemly, but unfortunately, that's kind of the system that we created. This is an absolute byproduct of trying to create this fixed election cycle. It allows the government to, take this period and, make these announcements to make it look like they're, doing good things around the country in all these different ridings. It doesn't always work. We can certainly point to the Ontario election as an example of that, but it certainly gives a government an opportunity to do that because that's how the incentive now works. This is kind of why, fixed election dates in my estimation are garbage. Our system, of course, is not only based on confidence, but because we've created a calendar around it, what it does is not only, make the election campaign a year long, but it also creates incentives for governments to behave like this, particularly when there is a long period between when Parliament rises and when the fixed election date happens. We could do away with this by basically avoiding the fixed election date altogether, and so that when a government is ready to call an election, They don't have this period by which they can just, go around the country and make spending announcements. That would make more sense. However, we are wrapped up in this kind of Americanized notion that fixed election dates are a good thing, which they're not. And so we've created this mess for ourselves. We did do things around the pre-writ period, which means that advertising and so on is now subject to strict restrictions. Government advertising is restricted now, but that's not the same thing as going around to a riding and saying, here's a big check for this project that we have approved for your riding. Even though the big check thing is a bit passé these days and we don't see it very often anymore, unlike in the conservative years when they were all over the place. So that's kind of what it means. This caretaker period won't happen until the writs are drawn up, which won't be until the beginning of September, at which point we will have the 6-ish week election period. At that point, yes, cabinet is on autopilot, and day-to-day functions still happen, but no major decisions are made. But in the meantime, the government has an incentive to go out and make spending announcement after spending announcement. And we've made this bed and now we get to lie in it. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.